welcome to the Unknown Warrior podcast with Pete and Jason from Squeaky Pedal. This episode we're kind of diving a bit deeper into the operation behind the Unknown Warrior and kind of the nuts and bolts really of how it kind of got back from France and the pomp and circumstance and the ceremony and how all that kind of interlinked.
So we've got author and historian Andrew Richards on the podcast today. So his book, The Flag, The Story of the Reverend David Railton MC and the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, mentions a little bit about the operation itself, to recover the bodies, and then what happens subsequently. So obviously David Railton's had this idea, it's been passed to the authorities like it, and they want to make this happen. So what are the kind of next steps then, Andy? What do they decide to do now?
Once the idea was approved by the Prime Minister and authority was given by the King, a committee was set up and formed by Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon of several MPs, including one Winston Churchill. And the real work of the organisation began because they had very, very short time to do this and get everything organised. And it's amazing the work that was done. I was able to find minutes of a subcommittee that was actually set up, and these are the guys who actually made sure all the nuts and bolts were put in place, the details of how and when and why, and it's amazing the amount of work that was done to put this thing together at such short notice. One of the gentlemen on this subcommittee was a Major General G.D. Jeffreys, he's a Grenadier Guard Major General who commanded 19th Division, which was David Railton's division that he was senior chaplain to. So he knew Jeffreys very well. And it's Major General Jeffreys and his staff that put basically the ceremonial side of this together once the Unknown Warrior arrived back in England. And today, really, I think you can look back and see a lot of the ceremonial things you see in London, particularly how remembrance services are carried out at Cenotaph, is based on this format. The orders that he gave out were in such great detail. They had tiny little, drawings and plans on and where in the station, where to form up and how long it was going to take to get there. So the planning was really, really incredible. And I think it goes without saying, you have to mention General Jeffreys really as being the driver behind this. Of these plans.
It's important to note that nothing really quite like this had ever happened before, had it really? And they got, like you say, an incredibly short period of time to create all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. The last sort of big ceremonial funeral was for Edward VII in 1910, and that was on no scale anywhere close to the Unknown Warrior. And the fact it went off flawlessly is just. It's just incredible, and Lord Curzon has to take huge credit for this. I mean, he was a foreign secretary, and he was known as the great ceremonial organizer. And one of the things you have to say is the way he planned it and who he invited to the Abbey and to be on the procession just shows you he tried to make it about people and not society. You know, the invites went out to many mothers that lost sons and husbands. And the cathedral really was packed with very common people. It wasn't a society gathering for sure. There were ministers and there were MPs, but it was full of people who had lost an awful lot during the war. And I think this is all down to Lord Curzon.
So to jump back then to St. Paul, and as the body's been chosen. And then so how do we end up from there to Westminster? What's the kind of next steps that are taken as the body's in St. Paul? What happens next after that?
You mentioned on the previous podcast that the great secrecy that took place of this, and basically after the selection, the next morning there was a multi-denominational service for the soldier before. He was carried in his coffin. It was draped with a flag, a Union Jack, and the ambulance was taken to Boulogne, where the city of Boulogne came out in force, and the streets were lined, and the body lay in state, basically, in a chapel Ardennes, which is a privilege given to VIPs, and it was guarded by French soldiers that night.
That's right, the French regiment specifically chosen to guard the Unknown Warrior overnight had been awarded the Légion d'honneur en masse. So they were specifically chosen for that honour because of their own conduct.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, these are soldiers who had seen a lot of sacrifice. That's for sure.
There's a lot of footage of the coffin of the unknown warrior arriving at the quayside in Boulogne in a French wagon. Its honour guard consisted of British and French soldiers, and the French General Ferdinand Foch, who was Supreme Allied Commander on the Western Front, gave a very moving speech. The coffin is then loaded into the waiting British destroyer HMS Verdun, the Verdun being specifically chosen as the vessel that would convey the body of the unknown warrior back to Britain in tribute to the French. Photographs and film footage of the time shows a Union flag draped on top of the coffin. There's a story that a flag that had been carried by the Reverend David Railton, the man who came up with the idea of the unknown warrior, during his time in the trenches was used. But is that actually the case, Andy?
At several stages, there are flags used on the coffin. And one of the things was David Railton was told was that his flag would be on the coffin of the unknown warrior all the way from St. Paul to Westminster Abbey. And if you look at the footage, you can see them pulling out a flag. One of the things I found was the orders of the Royal Navy to the captain of HMS Verdun to actually provide a flag. So there are many flags that go on and off the coffin, and it's David Railton's flag wasn't actually put onto the coffin until it arrived at Waterloo Station. And he, in a letter in the early 1950s to Westminster Abbey, he was a little bit taken aback by this, because basically right up until he died, he was told that his flag was actually used all the way. And we now know that not to be true. But we know his flag hangs in Westminster Abbey because it's very unique, and it's got several tears on it that we can say that was stitched up by his wife.
And it's important, I think, to mention just a little bit about the coffin at the moment that the body was placed into. This coffin had been specially made for the unknown warrior, containing oak from a tree that had been grown in Hampton Court Palace, and it was lined with zinc and basically had ironwork specially added to it, which was created by the Brunswick Ironworks at Carnarvon in Wales. The ironwork still exists there, actually, and they've got a plate there that they started writing the inscription on, and then the inscription was changed, so they had to do a new inscription, and that original inscription is still at Carnarvon Castle. But obviously it just goes to show the kind of the thought that's going into every aspect of this operation, really. It's choreography to kind of show connections throughout everything that's going on, really, isn't it?
It is. They had the people that planned this, the committee and the subcommittee, Lord Curzon and General Jeffreys, nobody knew the reaction that was going to take place, whether it was in France, whether it was at Dover when the HMS Verdun came alongside the quayside there. There's descriptions of people standing on the cliffs, the White Cliffs of Dover. There's, lining the railway line all the way up to London, as the coffin is inside a railway carriage and is taken up to Victoria Station. There's, each station has got rows and rows of soldiers presenting arms. There are people hanging off bridges. And really, the descriptions, again, you can read in a lot of the correspondence that wrote about it. We've never seen anything like this since, in the 100 years since. We really haven't.
We get to Victoria, and then it lays for another night there under another guard. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Connaught Rangers were actually given the task of being in the railway carriage, which was a converted luggage car that was used to convey the bodies of Edith Cavell and Captain Fryatt, who were both executed during the war by Germans. So it had great symbolism to it, and it was converted. The Connaught Rangers handed over responsibility at Victoria Station to King's Company of the Grenadier Guards, who then on platform 8 at Victoria Station kept vigil all night over the coffin before the procession took place the next morning.
And we should say as well that the Cavell band still exists, doesn't it, Jace? We were there just the other day. It's still running around.
We were indeed, and they have got a fantastic replica of the coffin that the unknown warrior still lies in, using ironwork from the Brunswick Ironworks and a special sword. So there was a Crusader sword that was given from the Royal Collection to adorn the top of the coffin, and there's a replica sword on top of that coffin as well. And what's surprising is that only until fairly recently. The people who owned the van didn't actually know its significance in the story, not only of the Unknown Warrior but of Eve Cavell and Captain Fryatt. So yeah, you can go and see that, and I would recommend everybody goes and sees that if they can.
So we're at Victoria Station. We've waited there overnight with under guard again, and then so how do we then go from Victoria to up the Mall and to the final kind of final resting place? How does that happen, and kind of how do you even start to kind of organise that? Because as you say, where do you start with the kind of organising that sheer amount of people? You know.
Well, I've looked at the plans, the drawings of part of General Jeffrey's orders. And I was trying to get my head around how it actually all worked out and laid out on the station there. And it's very difficult. As you know, we were at Victoria Station last year. Victoria Station was bombed during the Second World War, and it's changed. It's changed a lot. It's quite easy to say that, but they were able to form up between two platforms that morning. And the guard of the Unknown Warrior was handed over from King's Company to a bearer party commanded by a sergeant of the 3rd Battalion, the Coldstream Guards. And it's this sergeant that places David Railton's flag upon the coffin. We now know this, that basically the Dean of Westminster said, we don't want this flag, or it might have been General Jeffreys, we don't want this flag going all the way to France and getting lost. So he gave it to a good old sergeant, the Coldstream Guards, and he put it on the coffin. And we know, like I said earlier, it is that flag because of the tears and the rips you can see on it today, hanging in Westminster Abbey. The huge amount of planning that went into it, came to fruition. You had a band, you had a gun carriage on which the coffin was placed. The bearer party, who were soldiers from the Coldstream Guards, marched behind the gun carriage, and then around the gun carriage you had pallbearers. Now it's interesting to know the difference. Pallbearers were senior officers who were serving at the time, and amongst them was Admiral of the Fleet Earl Beatty, Sir Henry Wilson, and of course Lord Hague. And they escorted and marched all the way to the Cenotaph and then to Westminster Abbey alongside. And there were marching parties behind the carriage that came from all services, from the Navy, from the Army. And behind those were, I believe it's 400 ex-servicemen. A lot of these men had limbs missing. They were on crutches, and they managed to follow behind, and they formed up. And they came out of, I believe it's Eccleston Bridge Road, I think, to Hyde Park Corner, down the Mall, through Admiralty Arch, and along Whitehall to where the Cenotaph was adorned with two huge Union Jacks. And it was the Cenotaph, the new Cenotaph, was unveiled by the King before there was the 2-minute silence.
And yeah, it's important to note that the previous Cenotaph had been a temporary structure that was erected in 1919, hadn't it? It was made of wood and plaster. And then there was a campaign. They didn't really expect it to be a permanent thing. And then all of a sudden there was a campaign to keep it, really, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. I mean, I think it shocked everybody, the fact that they made it from wood and plaster. And then, several months later, it started to fall apart. I do believe that they didn't understand the outpouring, and it's just incredible. And I mentioned in my talk that I gave last year, I found first color footage of London in 1924 by a French film crew, and I can tell from the trees that it was springtime. And when they went down Whitehall, the footage of the Cenotaph, it was still covered in flowers, fresh flowers, and with women and children standing there. And it was a pilgrimage that thousands went every day to the Cenotaph and then to the tomb of the Unknown Warrior. And this was in 1924. And this wasn't around the time of Armistice Day. This was it must have been May or June time in London. And it was just incredible. It became an absolute focal point. One of the newspapers described it as the ground on which the Cenotaph lay was consecrated by the tears of many mothers, or, I'm paraphrasing again, but there was no way that they could not put anything there. And I think, the second Cenotaph, and having stood there many times myself, it is an incredible memorial.
And you see on the footage, the King places a wreath onto the coffin of the Unknown Warrior that was of bay leaves entwined with red roses. And what again is fascinating is that you can watch that happen on the footage, on the newsreel footage. as the new cenotaph is unveiled. So then it proceeds through to Westminster Abbey to be laid to rest in a very impressive ceremony you've just previously mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lord Curzon, as I said before, had made sure that the Abbey was not going to be full of, high society. It was full of people who had lost an awful lot during the war. And I think that added to the descriptions from Times correspondent that you could cut the atmosphere with a knife, and it was absolutely so moving. It's often said as British, we certainly do ceremonial the best of anybody in the world, and I think I like to think that we really do, and I think a lot of that comes from the way this service and the way this ceremony was conducted in November 1920.
Yeah, I think, as you say, you see some of the planning documents and the kind of, the minutes behind it, and it's just precision, isn't it? It's difficult to fathom as to the sheer manpower and the brain power going into, making sure that everyone is exactly where they're supposed to be at exactly the right time. It
is absolutely incredible. And one of the things I found on the film, and I got some help from a friend of mine, ex-Garrison Sergeant Major Billy Mott of the Welsh Guards. I had to call him and say, why are why? Because soldiers know that when you turn around ceremonially, you always turn around to the right. And I didn't understand why the band were going up to the cenotaph and turning to the left. And that's actually called countermarching. And the years I was in the guards, in the lifeguards, I didn't actually understand the band actually turned to the left. And it's because of their musical instruments. And so they actually allowed for the band to do this, and it's just the precision that is involved in this, and down to the detail,
It's really
quite incredible.
It's quite interesting as well. I read somewhere that permissions were given for the recording of the service, but only 2 hymns were of good enough quality to be included on the record, and these were some of the first electrical recordings ever sold to the British public. And there's a very grainy recording of one of the hymns on the Imperial War Museum website that you can listen to, which kind of shows as well, like you say, that people wanted a piece of this as well to keep as a memento, to be part of this ceremony.
Yeah, you only have to look at the numbers that were there in London and stayed in London and then came to London in the subsequent days afterwards. The photograph of the slab, the temporary slab that was put upon the unknown warrior of York, it's called a York slab, I believe, white granite, and it's very simple. It's very moving, and the flag is there at the foot of it, and it remains there for a year. The amount of people that went past, I mean, I've had all sorts of estimates, and people, it was in the millions. It really was, and I think it continued all through that year.
It is incredible to think. I mean, you've got the fact that the body is laid to rest in French soil that's been specifically brought back across. 100 sandbags of French soil, and then, as you've alluded to, the original stone, the York stone that was put on there, was replaced by a black Belgian marble stone just a year later on the 11th of November 1921. Dean Ryle again was instrumental in the composition of the inscription, and that is the stone that we are all familiar with today, that's on the tomb of the unknown warrior now.
It's strikingly beautiful, it really is. I mean, just I can remember looking at it from an angle, even amongst the amount of public you get in there now. I've never been able to stand there alone. I've had to go in through the public with everybody else, but it's just striking. It really is. The simplistic beauty of it just makes it, endearing to the nation.
And there's a little poignant thing that I was going to mention as well, the fact that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, when she married the future King George VI in 1923, she laid her bouquet at the tomb as a tribute to her brother who died at the Battle of Lewes. And that created a tradition that was observed right up to today, where royal brides would lay their bouquets onto the body of the unknown warrior.
Yeah, it's a fantastic tradition. I truly believe it actually came about as an accident. I think when she was going into Westminster Abbey through the door, a member of clergy fainted, and so the procession was held up there. And I think whether she planned it or not, I really don't know. But it came to her at that time. I think she looked up, she saw the flag, she looked down, and she just did it. I think it was on the spur of the moment. I don't think it was planned at all. I might be wrong. I've never come across any writings or anybody that's been able to say otherwise, but I think it really was on the spur of the moment. And it's truly inspiring. I mean, it really is. And her, on her death, a wreath was laid of her flowers from her funeral onto the grave of the unknown warrior.
Yeah, and it just shows the fact that they still do that, the fact that that has entered into rural tradition is just a nice demonstration of I think how everybody across the land at that time, like her own brother being killed, was felt the sorrow and the need to connect with this tomb in the same way that ordinary people had as well. And obviously it's become a national symbol throughout time, copied and mirrored across the globe.
At the time, she didn't know. They hadn't found his body, Fergus. They hadn't found her brother's body. Now they have found a body that they think is him, and they buried at Loo, and there is a marker to him. But for all she knew, it could have been her brother. And this is the beauty of it, is that everybody could think that this was their brother, their son, their husband. And that's the power of this symbol.
And speaking personally to yourself, it's now 100 years on from the commemoration of the Unknown Warrior. Do you still feel it plays a really important role in the commemoration of all conflicts now, not just the First World War, but right up to the present day?
I think it does. For me personally, it holds great symbolic meaning. I have friends that have died both in combat and since then, and it's around this time of year. It can be very painful for a lot of ex-servicemen around this time of year, but it's also very cathartic too. And I've caught myself standing several occasions when I've been visiting back, doing research back to the UK, standing at the cenotaph, and it's powerful. And then you go down to Westminster Abbey, and I think sometimes Westminster Abbey authorities have to open up to the public and allow people to pay homage at the grave of the unknown warrior. I know that you can go into Westminster Abbey for church services without paying the admission, but I really would like to see it opened up certain times of the year to the public. I think the fact it is behind closed doors, so to speak, is a hindrance to that. And I think the public being given certain days that they can go and pay their respects to the unknown warrior would be a great thing.
Yeah, and especially in times of COVID as well, and where we're not able to gather as we would normally in the numbers that we would normally to pay our respects. I think it would be important that people are able to go and visit that. But thank you very much, Andy, for your contribution there and for talking us through the quite elaborate and complex operation. And we hope to speak to you soon. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you for the invite. Thank you.